Well, tonight I'm going to take a little fork in the road and talk about something that's a little different, I guess. I've mentioned that I have a tendency to kind of make these videos a little bit on the troublesome side because I'm always talking about some trouble I got into and how I can maybe tell about the experience in such a way that I can help somebody out of it. And I guess you could think of the one I'm thinking of tonight a little bit that same way, but it's quite a lot different. I don't know if you're like me, but every now and then you get in the right situation and get away from all the chatter and the noise boxes and the ball game screens and the traffic and just the social commotion that goes on and way too much of our lives, I think. Anyway, if you can get away from that for long enough, and I've mentioned finding a place where for me, it works in nature. It doesn't have to be deep in the woods either. It can be just a quiet spot in your backyard. I think one of the most valuable pieces of furniture I own is a hammock. I know that might make me sound real lazy, but I've had several of them, and I've had some really good experiences in a hammock. If you haven't tried a nice hammock under a tree with the birds singing overhead or whatever, you're missing out. And I've had hammocks that I have taken on family picnics and reunions and just, maybe a campfire experience up in one of the canyons or something. And I've taken a hammock, and not so much earlier in my life, but then these later years, there's just nothing quite like getting in a hammock and having a little grandchild come over and say, "Grandpa, will you boost me up?" And I'll boost him or her up, and pretty soon maybe another one will come over and say, "Grandpa, can I get up there too?" And so I load one or two of them in on both sides, and we just kind of lay there and talk about whatever they want to talk about. Sometimes it's kind of silly stuff that I would have thought about talking about, I guess, when I was their age. I call it silly now, but it's pretty important then. And so I try to listen carefully and see what they're thinking. And they usually, if you give them time and kind of set them up with a prompting question or two, they start to think about things, and they just lay there, and it's the best. So I have a fondness for hammocks and grandkids that I think you could appreciate. I think anytime you get a chance to, whether it's your own children or grandchildren or something else, if you get a chance to tell a story to a kid, why they seem to be happy and want more, like I did when I was a boy. So this alone and thinking time has lately taken me to an event that happened in my life. And it's kind of interesting how there can be a delay, like 50 or 60 years, and all of a sudden something that I guess maybe should have been meaningful but wasn't, all of a sudden works its way up through the sludge and surfaces to the top, and it just keeps, and you just keep thinking about it. And I'm going to relate an experience tonight that kind of fits into that category. It happened when I was, it's a longer story than I'm going to make it, but the part that I'm going to make longer is the part that really impacted me, and the part that my thoughts now kind of center around. I mentioned that I was involved in the Boy Scouts early on, and one of the programs that they had that kind of prepared you for the Boy Scouts was to prepare you to be the very first classification you could get in the Boy Scouts was a tenderfoot. But before you could even be a tenderfoot, there's certain things that you had to do. You had to have some understanding and some skills and do some things outdoors that kind of prepared you for what was coming. And anyway, we had what we called a guide patrol class. You'd have to look it up to get the history of it. But so I was a guide patrol member, and there were the class was just for boys because it was preparation for the Boy Scouts of America. And I realize all that's changed now, but back in those days, it was the Boy Scouts of America. And this class was just for boys, and there were 9 boys in the class. And they were my classmates at school, and it spanned not just my classmates, but it included some maybe a year older or a year younger, depending on how long we were in the class. And the class was always a little bit, what should I say, rambunctious. maybe is a polite way to say it. On some days, we couldn't, when you get about 9 boys in a room, and the room wasn't very big, and I can still remember the shape of the room and everything about it. Anyway, you get 9 boys in a room, and invariably there's some goofy stuff that goes on. And you've heard the phrase, boys will be boys. Well, guide patrol boys will be guide patrol boys. And I found out later on in my years, I wasn't directly involved with Cub Scouts, which I think this guide patrol thing eventually evolved into that. But Cub Scouts, oh my word. Have you ever taken them somewhere and then brought them home or whatever, and they can't sit still, they're in the back seat, and pretty soon they're laughing about things they shouldn't be laughing about, and just, don't let your mind get too carried away, but they're a rambunctious group, and they're not that easy to deal with. I'm usually not the person you can drive crazy, but I came close a time or two when I had a bunch of Boy Scouts in the car coming home from this or that. So anyway, this guide patrol class was probably a precursor to the Cub Scouts. So, like I said, boys will be boys, and we were, I think, all of that and maybe more. And there were 9 of us, and you'll never guess who our leader was. Who would you think they'd pick for a leader for 9 rambunctious Cub Scout age guide patrol boys who had to do all this outdoor prepping stuff and get ready for the big time Boy Scouts and make it exciting and this, that, and the other? Who do you think they'd get to do something like that? You're thinking probably, well, maybe my mother? Nope, you'd be wrong. It wasn't any of those 9 boys. It wasn't any of their mother, and it wasn't any of their dads, which maybe is what it should have been. I don't know. I'll tell you who it was. It was a lady by the name of Charlotte Matthews. Now let me describe Charlotte just a little bit. She was a person about my age right now. She was, just like I'm a retired school teacher, she was a retired school teacher. And she always wore a dress, usually a gray or anyway, a darker colored dress, black or gray or dark blue or something like that. And it was always a long dress, came down almost to her ankles, which is kind of the way, you know, if you think of the time period that she grew up in. Why? Because, I mean, we're talking when I was in this class with these boys, it would have been about just 1960, 1961, thereabouts. So keep in mind, she was 75 years old then. That would have made her. I don't know exactly how old she was, but she looked old, and kind of like me, maybe older, if that can happen. But she would come in, and there'd be 9 of us. So if you can, like I said, if you can imagine, you know, the time period that she would have grown up in would have been 1890s forward, thereabouts. And if you go back and look at the history of what school teachers looked like back in those days, and then can imagine a retired one, and then can imagine her being in charge of 9-year-old boys, 9 of them in this class. Well, I won't go through all the things we had to do, but we had little books, and we learned about leaves and birds and trees and fires and matches, and we'd learn about first aid stuff, and we'd learn about exercise and how to take care of your body, and we'd learn about good things to read and study. We'd learn about how to take care of dishes and you know, different safety. I don't think we ever really did anything with guns, but we may have talked about them, but we never had anything that we practiced on, I guess, for obvious reasons. Didn't want us killing each other. But anyway, did a lot of things that were supposed to get us ready for the Boy Scouts. And one of those things was a little bit like it wasn't like a Boy Scout merit badge, because we didn't get a merit badge, but we had to do some checking off of some things. And one of them was a hiking experience. And I can remember us going on some little hikes there around the church where we had the guide patrol class. And you know, it wasn't all that long. And of course, we didn't get tired. And Boy Scouts or Cub Scouts never get tired anyway. They don't get tired of walking, and they don't get tired of talking and carrying on. So that was us. Well, turned out that one of the hikes we had to go on it must have been a 10-mile hike, because I remember we did it on a day when we didn't have school. It was in the later spring, because the snow was melted off the roads, and so I'm guessing it was, you know, mid-May or late May or something like that, probably on a Saturday. And I don't mean to be disrespectful at all when I say this old maid, but if you could close your eyes and in your mind's eye see an old maid in a dark dress with gray hair bobbed in a bun on top of her head. And have you ever heard somebody say, those look like old maid shoes? Well, there is such a thing, and she wore them all the time. And guess what? She even wore them on this day when we had a 10-mile hike. And she was in charge of these 9 boys, and we were going to hike 10 miles from our church house up to a campground up just where a canyon started, and there was a campground, and that was our goal, was to start at the church and get to the campground. And she was our leader. You can kind of imagine how that played out, because she did anything but lead on that hike. We started out, and I think she told us, now don't get, if I remember right, she said, don't get too far ahead. She knew we were going to be ahead, but she said, don't get too far ahead. I need to keep track of you. I'm responsible for you. And in her little old maid voice, and her sweet little personality, and she kind of walked with a limp. I'm not sure, I can identify with that because I got a bad leg of my own. And after that many years of living, you just come up with things that cause you to limp and other things. So we start out on the hike at the church, and she gives us that little talk, and we're off. She told us which side of the road to walk on, and said, don't get too far ahead. And anyway, we were so anxious to get hiking because, the campground up there sounded pretty exciting. That's 10 miles away. Well, so away we went, and I can't remember. I didn't really lead out, but I was right in there with the pack, and we had to kind of go single file because she told us not to get out in the road. So we stayed on the side of the road and went single file, but it didn't take us very long. Holy cow, it didn't take us very long at all, like 30 minutes. And we would look back and we'd have to stop and wait for her to catch up because she was hobbling along in those high-heeled shoes and her dark dress and her little gray hair and her bun on her head. And, it was just hard for her to keep up. And so we kind of groan every time we'd look back and say, we got to stop. Well, we got up, we kept going like that and thinking that we ought to stop. And finally we just gave up on that idea and just took off. So now we were way ahead of her, and she's coming along behind, but I'm thinking, as much as a half a mile ahead of her. And sometimes we couldn't even see her when we'd go over a little hill or around a corner or something. We couldn't see where she was, and we'd keep looking back. She just kind of looked like a little figure back there on the edge of the road. She was still standing vertical, so we thought, well, she's coming. And I can remember us getting up there closer to where the entrance to the canyon was. And I don't know why, but this is where my memory kicks in. Because I can remember hiking along there, and there was this little pile of rocks off to the side of the road in one spot. And for some reason, I just kind of sat on that, and the other boys passed me by and went on up the road. And I kept sitting on the rocks, just kind of taking in the experience. And I thought, well, I'll just see if I can see her back there somewhere. Poor Charlotte. And I could see her. And sure enough, she was coming, but she was just dragging further behind. And I remember thinking, what in the world? When I was sitting on that rock, I think, what in the world would you take a job like this for? I mean, what inspired you to say, yes, I'll take care of those 9 boys. I'll do it. Why would you do something like that? And for the life of me, I couldn't figure it out. And I just sat there thinking about it, kind of watching her. For some reason, I was starting to wonder if maybe she was all right. Or anyway, I sat there longer than I thought I would when I first sat down, and the other boys had gone up ahead, and I saw them kind of stop off the side of the road too on another little hillside thing. They stopped and sat down. So I just thought, well, I'm not going to get too far behind. I'll just stay here and see if I can keep an eye on her. I guess I must have felt for her a little bit, because I just empathized with anybody that would do something like that without being compelled to do it. Why? Why would you put yourself through that with old maid high heels on, for heaven's sakes? And she walked with a cane. I forgot to mention that, but she walked with a cane and she had a limp. Old maid high heels and just an old lady. And the longer I thought about that, the more of an impression that it made on me, like she must really care about us. Then I remember I started thinking, well, if she cares about us, and how come we don't show more care toward her? I mean, why are we just being rowdy all the time? And why do we walk clear out in front of her and disobey and just stretch her patience, I'm sure, to the limits? Why do we do all that? And I sat there, and it was a nice warm day. Had that going for me, and she just kept kind of inching closer and closer and closer. And I'd watch and think, oh man, I hope I'm smarter than that when I get to be her age. I'd never do a job like that. First of all, even if I was without high heels, I wouldn't do a job like that. And there she was with those high heels. I can't imagine what they would have felt like on her feet. But she was just patient. One foot in front of the other one. Kept coming and coming and coming. Well, I won't go through the whole journey. But for some reason, sitting there on that rock, there was an impression made on I guess I'd just say it was made on my soul. And it was an impression that I kept thinking back on for the next 60 years of my life, 65 years of my life, or more. When I stop thinking, or I start thinking about somebody putting their heart and soul into doing their job, or doing something maybe that they didn't want to do, I'd think of her, Charlotte Matthews, and I'd think, the whole world ought to have more Charlotte Matthews people in it. The whole world should. Because while I was sitting there thinking, she had an impact. I don't think she knows it. I don't think, I know I never told her. I never did tell her. Now, if she were alive today, by the way, she died, she can't live forever. She died not too long after that. And I never did tell her how her dedication to 9 boys made an impact on me, and just the effort that she made to do it, and her acceptance of that duty. And I never did tell her how much it meant to me. But as I went through life, it meant a lot to me. So I found that I reflect upon myself a little bit, and I think, maybe things that influences maybe that I don't have, or that I do have, I might not even know that I'm having. Maybe something that I'm doing just because I feel like I need to, or maybe it's because I want to, but nobody really knows it. And I do it, and there's no recognition, or there's nobody says thanks or anything else. I just do it for some reason because I feel like I should. And I wonder sometimes if we don't need a whole lot more of those kind of people. 75-year-olds or no. I mean, nobody would choose, none of us would have chosen a 75-year-old maid to be our guide patrol leader, for heaven's sakes. If they'd left it up to us, we would never have chosen her. But her dedication to that job and us boys made an impact. And I don't think it just made the impact on me while I was sitting on that rock thinking about it, though that's the moment that I reflect back on. I think it made an impact on my whole life because it affected the way I reacted to different things that I needed to do, that I did. And she was the example. She was the one that you'd point to if you wanted to look to somebody that dedicated her life to a group of boys. I don't know what we could have done if we'd had a young, vibrant man, and I don't know what kind of an impact he would have had on us. I'm sure it would have been different, and it may have even been better in some ways. But there were some really good things that came out of that old lady's effort. And it sank into our hearts and minds. At least it did mine. And it affected my life from that point forward. Especially as I got older. Started to identify with what it was like to be old and still asked to do some things. Because of her example, I think I tried a little harder. Maybe did a little better than I would have done otherwise. I never went to her funeral. I was off to school, married and off to school when she died. And I never really researched her life. I know she was married to a really old man, and they lived on a farm, so she had some commonalities with me, I'm sure, with that farming lifestyle. But the reason I mention that is because my hope is that maybe you'll find one of those rocks to sit on, and you might not be looking at an old lady in high heels and old maid shoes, and gray hair and a bun in her head, and walking with a cane up a road. It's the side of a road with a bunch of boys, but there are people like that in your life, of whatever age, that have given pretty much everything they could and received nothing in return and made an impact on you. I'm convinced those people are there. My encouragement to you with this video is that you'll find one of those rocks or stumps or benches and clear your head of other things and figure that out. And if there's still time, go look them up. Get alone with them somewhere and tell them how much you really appreciate it. I wish that I had done that. I wish that I'd looked her up and or been able to look her up and tell her that I was away to school and didn't bother to do it when I got home. And quite frankly, it meant a lot. It meant a lot to me, but it meant the meaning didn't come till even after my early married years. I was too busy thinking about other things. So there is a peace that comes with a thank you. And I hope that you'll never miss the opportunity to look somebody up. In fact, I'll mention something right now that happened today along these lines. I had a boy that I taught in school, and interesting, I ought to get the exact words out because it just came today on my phone. But you've heard me talk about Thoreau in this MTC channel that I've created, and you've heard me talk about Thoreau. And well, I was talking about Thoreau 45, 50 years ago to this boy who is now a man, a happily married man with, I think, either 3 or 4 children. And he kind of stayed away from technology, but he wrote me a letter today and he said, I've got to thank you for introducing me to Thoreau. He says, I've got, I think he said 700 pages of his journal. Now, that's one to me. I didn't know he had that many pages. I knew he'd written some journals, just thoughts off the top of his head. And I'm sure he's read what few books he wrote, the most significant one being Walden. But he's on a ranch in the middle of Wyoming, off by himself, away from all the technology, and just as his wife and family. And he doesn't have a Facebook page, but he got on his wife's Facebook Messenger and he introduced himself. He says, I'm Derek, and you had such an impact on me when I was going to school. And I loved Thoreau as much as you did, and I've been reading about him ever since, and he continues to influence me and make a difference in the way I think about things and approach life. And I happen to know because I visited with his mother a little bit, not too many years after he'd gone out of there, and she said he has really blossomed. When I knew him, he was quite shy, quite insecure, never was very talkative, but he thought a lot. And that counts. It counts for a lot. It counted for a lot for him. It counted a lot for me when I was trying to think about why that lady, as struggling as she was with aging conditions, would follow along and try to help 9 pre-scout kids in the guide patrol class with a 10-mile hike. You know some of those people. If you do, try to set it right with them. You'll find out that when you set it right with them, you'll set it right in your mind, and you'll have some peace and some joy that you couldn't get any other way if you'll just express it some way, like this boy did to me today, and like I should have done way sooner before this lady died. Dear, dear Charlotte. Life's good. Come back to the MTC whenever you can. Bye.